This is Chapter 14, Notes, Part 1. Chapter 14 is all about the definition of a species and what makes some organisms able to be called a species, while other organisms don't fall into the category of that same species. We will continue to see some trends from Chapter 13, natural selection, and those ideas will continue throughout the entire school year. So as we move into a new chapter, it's not like we just wipe clean everything from the previous chapter. Natural selection and evolution is an idea and a theme that you'll see throughout the entire year, so it's important to remember everything that came before. So to kind of remind you a little bit about Chapter 13, Chapter 13 was all about natural selection and the idea that some organisms are better suited to their environment. They survive because of adaptations that they have. An adaptation is a trait that's coded by DNA. That adaptation helps the organism survive in a particular environment. But if the environment changes, what was once a good trait might no longer be considered a good trait. It is extremely important that you understand that organisms are not forced to adapt. They do not have to change. Often I see that students write things like they were forced to change or they had to change if they wanted to survive. Well, I cannot change my DNA in order to survive. I am born with my DNA. If it's good DNA, I survive, could probably have babies. If I have bad DNA, I'm probably going to die before I have a chance to have babies. At least that's the way it goes out in nature. So it's extremely important that you understand that an organism is born with its DNA, and that DNA is either good or it's bad. This little picture here kind of shows exactly that. At the beginning of the scenario, there's bunnies of all different fur color. They were born with DNA that coded for their fur color. Of course, in this cold habitat, it is better to be camouflage white so that you are not seen by the predator. The predator is going to hunt anything that has bad traits, or in this case, the brown fur. So it will be only the white traits that survive and reproduce, thus producing more white bunnies because they will pass on the DNA that they have, and thus in the future the population will be predominantly white. This brown rabbit here did not change his DNA. He was just tough out of luck from the get-go. So they are not adapting to survive. They just coincidentally survive or not based on the DNA that they have. Chapter 13 was all about microevolution, micro meaning small. So we are talking about small changes within a population. In that previous scenario, I had bunnies at the beginning. I still had the same bunnies at the end. All that changed was their fur color, but they were still at the end of the scenario bunnies. So it is within the population. Macroevolution will be new in this chapter. Macro means big, a big change, and those big changes are speciation and extinction. We'll get into those in the future, meaning in part 2 of the notes. But speciation is the formation of a brand new species, and you guys are familiar, extinction is the idea that an entire species dies off. Next, we go into the definition of a species. What is a species? You guys have heard that word many times, like we as a species are Homo sapiens. So the definition of a species is a group of organisms that can breed in nature, meaning they would normally find each other in nature, and they can produce fertile offspring. This fertile offspring is a huge component of the definition, which we'll dive more into in just a moment. But that means that their babies can have babies. Unfortunately, this one definition of a species isn't really good enough for biologists because there's too many exceptions or things that we might not know if they can breed and produce fertile offspring. So just having this one definition isn't really good enough. So actually, there's several ways to define what species are. So we're going to go through those quickly here. So one of them is exactly what I just told you. Members of a species can breed in nature and produce fertile offspring. There have been many cases where humans have intervened and created offspring from organisms that wouldn't normally mate. By this definition, biological species, those crossbred animals would not actually be a true species. So like this one, hey, this guy's in Tiger King. I didn't notice that because I haven't looked at this in a year, and Tiger King wasn't out last year. But this guy is a liger, a lion and a tiger bred together. Well, in nature, lions and tigers don't live in the same habitat, so they would never naturally mate. So by this definition, the liger here, the cross between the lion and the tiger, the liger would not technically be a species because those organisms would never breed in nature. This guy is a cross between a polar bear and a grizzly. This guy crossed between a whale and a dolphin. Same idea. Those organisms in nature wouldn't actually be able to breed, maybe because of physical differences or just the fact that they don't hang out in the same areas or same social circles. Also, these crossbred animals are oftentimes sterile, meaning the liger cannot have a liger baby. This polar bear grizzly mix can't have any babies of its own. They're usually sterile because they have an odd number of chromosomes. And so when they go to make an egg or a sperm, you can't split an odd number in half to give the baby half of your DNA if you've got an odd number. So those organisms then can't ever produce babies. But this definition, like I mentioned, isn't really great because let's say we've got T-Rex and a Brontosaurus. How do I know if they could mate? They're both totally dead, totally extinct. So I don't know, maybe they could mate. So just that one definition isn't really good enough for biologists. So we've got this other definition, morphological species concept. Morphology means what does the organism look like? So this definition is based on physical features and what the organism simply looks like. I can look back at fossils and I can see, wow, these two organisms, T-Rex and Brontosaurus, they really don't look alike at all. So I would bargain that they cannot have babies in nature. And that's kind of the conclusion that scientists come to. If organisms look so different, they probably were different species. These fish here all kind of look similar. Maybe they were all the same species. We don't know for sure because that population of fish is extinct now. This definition also works well for asexual organisms. An organism that's asexual doesn't need a mate to produce a baby. So if I'm saying the definition of a species is that they can breed and produce fertile offspring, well, where do asexual organisms fit into that? So this definition also works for things like bacteria, which come in a variety of shapes. I can study what do they look like and determine are they the same species or not. A third definition is the ecological species concept, meaning that species are defined by what they do in their environment, meaning who do they eat, who eats them, where do they hang out? Do they hang out in the treetops? Do they hang out on the forest floor? What organisms do they encounter in their daily life? Ecological species concept is not widely used, but it's just an example of one more definition that we have. A final definition is the phylogenetic species concept. Phylogeny means relatedness. We'll get into this a whole lot in chapter 15, and we'll learn how to read these diagrams. But the idea of phylogeny is that organisms are related based on ancestry. So like peeking into the past, we can see that organisms are related based on which species they evolved from. A phylogenetic tree is that diagram. We're going to come back to this a little bit more in the future, so I'm not going to really spend a lot of time on this right now. Continuing on, what keeps then species separate? How come some organisms in nature don't just have babies? Whales and dolphins, they live in the ocean. The ocean is a big place, but I'm sure they cross paths many times. So why don't they have babies in nature? And the answer to that is due to reproductive barriers. They're things that keep reproduction from happening. They isolate or they separate a population so that they do not mate. That then causes the gene pools to become different. In this little scenario here, I've got some birds on an island. I've got some birds on the main continent. These two populations won't mate because there is physically a huge amount of space between them, and that space is water that's not like a flyable distance. So this population of birds is going to accumulate genes, and their gene pool is going to change separately from the gene pool over here. The DNA between the two will not end up mixing. What might end up happening is that this gene pool on the island becomes so vastly different from the gene pool on the mainland that it will then be impossible for those birds to mate. This is what we're going to look at for the next couple minutes, ways in which this happens. If these two bird populations do become so different and they can no longer mate, at that point, I would then define them as being totally separate species. They are incapable of mating. So there's a few ways that that can happen. Those ways in which that isolation can happen, those reproductive barriers can happen, they can occur before or after the organisms mate. So 3 quick definitions, and then we'll dive into how do these species become isolated from one another. A zygote is a word you probably have not heard before. A zygote is a fertilized egg, meaning that the sperm has gone into the egg and a little embryo or the little baby is starting to grow. Some barriers will prevent that from happening, meaning the egg and the sperm will never meet. An example of that was on the previous page with the birds. On an island, the egg of this bird is never going to meet the sperm of that bird because there's too much physical space between them. I would call that a pre-zygotic barrier, meaning it occurs before the zygote, before the fertilized egg. A pre-zygotic barrier prevents organisms from mating or prevents fertilization from happening. A post-zygotic barrier, post meaning after, would occur when the egg is already fertilized, but then things go downhill from there. So even though the egg and the sperm do meet, that little growing embryo does not develop completely into a normal adult. All right, let's dive into examples of pre-zygotic and post-zygotic. These are all reproductive barriers. Pre-zygotic barriers, there are 5 of them. Number 1, we saw with that bird example. That is called habitat isolation, or you could also call it geographic isolation. It's the same thing. It means that the two populations are physically separated. They do not access one another. They live in different places. One example of this is the squirrels pictured by the Grand Canyon. The Grand Canyon formed over a long period of time, around 6 million years ago. That Grand Canyon formed because the Colorado River here started cutting and slicing through the rock layers. So it's believed that at one time, before the Colorado River cut through and formed the canyon, there was just a flat surface of land here where the canyon is now, but prior to the canyon. And on that flat surface, there lived a species of mammals similar to what we would call a squirrel today. And those little squirrel creatures could run freely across from zone to zone because there was nothing stopping them. There was no canyon, no river there. But then at some point, the Colorado River started to cut through there. And when the Colorado River cut through there and cut and formed the canyon, this did not happen overnight. It took a long period of time. But gradually over time, that population of land mammals got split in half, such that half of the land mammals were living on one side of the canyon, meaning on one side of the river, and half of the small mammals were living on the other side of the river. It would be impossible for the little mammal to go all the way on a journey down the canyon, swim across the river, travel up the canyon, and find a mammal on the other side to mate with. So there is now a physical, geographic separation between the two populations. Fast forward many millions of years of evolution, and the population on what's shown here on the left side accumulated alleles and sort of changed which traits were favorable and unfavorable based on predators, based on food available, based on the specific habitat on that side of the canyon, and they accumulated genes that were good for them on that side. Similarly, the mammals on the other side accumulated genes that were favorable for living on that side of the canyon. There was no mixing of genes between the two populations because it was physically too far for an individual squirrel to travel. Fast forward again to today. Today we have what we would call squirrels, and these squirrels are now two different species. You can see the name of the organism here. But they are now two separate species, and even when they are put together, meaning a human puts them together, they will not be capable of mating because they have become totally separate species. They have each adapted to their individual side of the canyon and have changed so much so that they can no longer breed. A second example, just to hit really quick, are these owls pictured on the right. You can see that the northern spotted owl lives here on the coast. The Mexican spotted owl lives a little bit more inland. And again, this is too far of a distance for one little owl to ever fly. So we have a population that is physically separated from another population. The gene pools do not mix. Prezygotic number 2 is behavioral isolation. So again, this will be before the egg and the sperm ever meet. It prevents the egg and sperm from meeting. Behavioral isolation is just the idea that maybe the way that an organism attracts a mate is so unique that an organism of another species would be like, what in the world are you doing? Examples of this are a lot of really weird bird mating dances. Birds stomp their feet, they puff up their feathers, they like run around in circles and do all this squawking. There's a lot of weird behaviors that different birds have to attract a mate. And a bird of another species wouldn't find that attractive and thus wouldn't mate. So it's the idea that it's usually the male who's trying to attract a female. So the idea is that the male is doing some weird behavior to get the females to mate with him, but a female of a different species wouldn't find that attractive and thus wouldn't mate with him. Another example is the firefly. different species of fireflies are attracted to different flashing patterns. So kind of the whole reason that fireflies or lightning bugs flash is to attract a mate. So depending on the length of the flashes, like how long it's lit up, and then the frequency of how many flashes there are in a certain period of time, the female lightning bugs get really excited about the pattern that they are attracted to. So that keeps them mating with only those who have a pattern that they like. This then could end up splitting a population in half if they're only being attracted to the flashing pattern that they like. Third prezygotic is temporal. Temporal means time. The idea that some organisms might mate at different times. You can see in this frog population, species A mates in the spring and species B mates in the fall. So if there is a female who's ready to mate in the spring, she is not going to be mating with anybody in species B because she's ready to go in the spring. Similarly, if there's a female who's ready to mate in the fall, she would never mate with a male frog who was ready to mate in the spring. So this might end up splitting the population so much so that they become different species because their gene pools are not mixing. The egg and the sperm of species A is never going to meet the egg and the sperm of species B. Same is true for the crickets. Temporal, it could be different seasons, or it could just be different times of day. Like a nocturnal animal that's up at night and active at night is not going to mate with an organism that's sleeping at night. So temporal just being timing prevents egg and sperm from meeting. Fourth one is mechanical isolation, the idea that there might be physical differences that prevent mating. A very extreme example, which I put on here just as kind of a silly example, is the elephant and the mouse. If you imagine like a male elephant and his male sex organs and this little female mouse, like the pieces are not going to fit together in order to get sperm to fertilize the female's egg. That's a very extreme example. A little bit less extreme and more realistic is like these snails here. The snail shell is three-dimensional, so this is kind of like coming out towards you, right? It's a three-dimensional shell. And then this one is also three-dimensional. So the shells have to align in a certain way that these organisms, these snails, can get their bodies physically close enough that the male can inject the sperm into the female. If the swirling patterns don't allow the snails to get physically close enough, they won't be able to mate. One very vivid example of this that's burned into my brain is from when I was at U of I and I was taking an agriculture class, which was also a biology class, because down in Southern Illinois, there's a whole lot of agriculture students, simply because the majority of our state of Illinois is agriculture, other than here in the Chicago area. So I enrolled in a biology class that was kind of crossed with an agriculture class, and it was all about fertilization and reproduction. It was actually one of the most interesting classes I took at U of I. But one day we went to a farm, and the idea of the farm visit was to learn about artificial insemination, which is huge in agriculture. You want to get the best sperm to fertilize your females so that you can get good, strong livestock or good fatty livestock or livestock that will produce a lot of milk or whatever particular trait you're going for. But during the artificial insemination course at the farm, they collected sperm from a male pig, and the male pig's sex organ, which I did not know prior to this, is essentially shaped like a corkscrew. The idea being that the female pig has the reverse shape of the corkscrew inside of her, so her female sex organ is reversely shaped, so that when the male sex organ goes into the female, the pressure from the female's sex organ is strong enough to allow sperm to be released. So this idea of this swirling sex organ that's shaped like a corkscrew has to perfectly match the female that it wants to mate with. A pig of a different species or a non-pig species would not be able to apply the same pressure to the male sex organ to release the sperm. So that was a very vivid example for me, but just another example that the sex organs have to fit together in order for the egg and the sperm to ever meet up. And then the fifth prezygotic barrier is gametic isolation. It's the idea that the egg and the sperm do come close together, so mating does happen. The male is attracted to the female, they're in the same location, they're mating at the same time of day, they understand the behavioral pattern, the sex organs match up together, all is good and dandy, but wait! Once the sperm gets to the egg, the sperm maybe cannot get into the egg, or maybe the female's reproductive tract is so acidic or so basic that it kills the sperm, or the sperm go into the female and they're just like swimming aimlessly around and they don't know where to go, because normally on the surface of the egg there's all these chemical signals that attract the sperm. So gametic isolation is kind of the idea that everything prior to this was good, but now the sperm and the egg don't actually join. Those 5 are all prezygotic. They prevent a fertilized egg. To conclude, there are 3 postzygotic. Postzygotic occurs after the egg and the sperm have fertilized and formed the zygote. So number 1 is reduced hybrid viability. A hybrid is this organism that's a cross between 2 organisms. So in this example, the zygote fails to mature. We have a nice fertilized egg, but nothing ever happens beyond that egg stage, meaning we never have a birth of a baby. This happens a lot in frog populations, where frogs of different species can mate, but then the eggs never end up hatching. Example number 2, reduced hybrid fertility. This goes back to all of the crossbred kind of man-made animals, where we have a hybrid formed and the hybrid can live a good and happy life, but then that hybrid organism can't have any babies. An example of this is the mule. You guys are probably familiar with a mule. A mule is a cross between a horse and a donkey. When a mule is born, it has 63 chromosomes. It got half from the donkey and half from the horse. It has 63 chromosomes. It lives a good, happy life, but then it cannot make egg or sperm because it would need to cut 63 in half to pass on half to its baby, and there is no way to do that biologically to create an egg and sperm that can survive. So in this particular case, we have a baby born, it lives a fine life, but it can't end up having babies itself. And then lastly, 3, hybrid breakdown. This one really only occurs in plants and isn't as common, I guess, but this is a postzygotic barrier where the babies can have babies, all is fine and good. They mate, they have a baby, the baby's born, lives a good life, that baby can have babies, but then that baby that's born isn't like as fit or like as strong. I don't know if strong is the best word to use, but it's not as good as the normal purebred babies. I'm going to conclude there, and we'll continue with the 14 notes in part 2.